Well, I think that's the nicest introduction I've ever had, to have made such a difference in somebody's life. So let me just enjoy that for a moment. And I also want to say I'm very honored to be included in this evening because I so much respect the work that Steph and many others are trying to do to make the world a better place for all children, and in particular the children that she's been speaking about. And I'm going to be focusing in my remarks on indigenous children, especially indigenous children of Guatemala, Mayan children, but also indigenous heritage kids of Mexico and the United States, and to throw into it some patterns that carry over to probably everybody in the world. I'm going to focus in on ways of learning in indigenous communities of the Americas, which I call learning by observing and pitching in. This is a way of doing things that is not limited to indigenous communities and indigenous families and children. I think everybody engages in learning by observing and pitching in. But what I'm hoping to be showing you this evening is that this is especially prominent as a way of learning in indigenous communities of the Americas. And I think we have a lot to learn, all of us, a lot to learn from the ways that things are organized in indigenous communities of the Americas, as well as the strengths that children bring to learning and to life from engaging in learning by observing and pitching in. This is not important only for indigenous kids to have an easier time in schools and other places, but it's also, I believe, provides a model for all of us. Even though we all engage in learning by observing and pitching in, we aren't very aware of it. And so part of my goal is to make us more aware of this way of learning so that we can use it more and be more familiar with what it can give us. So the first thing I'd like to do is give you an example of it. And you'll notice that this is not an indigenous child who is the example. Try to think about the ways the child is learning.
The final key to the sounds of the glyphs would be found by David Stuart, whose education as a Mayanist began at an early age. His father, George, often brought him along on field trips to Mesoamerica.
What really got me, though, was while we were at Coba, there were a couple of monuments that were actually discovered. My dad would drop everything and work on drawing the monument. And I would just sort of look over his shoulder while he was doing that and thought, gee, this is pretty amazing.
He decided he would go out and draw some himself. So he'd take his crayons and paper and everything and go out and started drawing hieroglyphs.
By the time we got back to the States, my inner soul had been so affected by that experience that I just wanted to keep going back.
Two years later, George took David to meet Linda Sheely.
I remember kind of sitting there quietly in the office while she was drawing a glyph, and I don't know why I blurted this out, but I said, "Oh, that's a fire glyph." And Linda kind of paused, and I remember she sort of looked behind her shoulder and over at me and said, "Yeah, you're right, kid, that's a fire glyph."
George said that they would really appreciate it if there was ever a chance that David could study with me or something. And so on the spur of the moment, I said, why didn't he come down to Palenque this summer?
She allowed me to help her check her drawings. We were in the temples with flashlights, with her drawings on clipboards, making corrections.
I gave him the tablet of the cross, told him to go out on the back porch and figure out as much as he could about it. He came back a couple of days later and had the same amount of structural understanding of the text that it had taken me 3 years to do. And so I figured then that he was really quite good.
At age 12, David presented his first scholarly paper on Maya hieroglyphs.
And he gives a paper that was certainly beyond the abilities of about 2/3 or 3/4 of the audience to follow. It was a scholarly paper.
So, you may think that this is an unusual child, but one of the features of this child that's unusual is the opportunity he has to be present and involved and accepted and immersed and contributing to this activity that we see him developing expertise in. He's unusual in that respect for a child of highly educated parents who usually have very few opportunities to actually be engaged in the activities of their family and community. And that is a central feature of learning by observing and pitching in, being able to be present and part of things. Now I want to mention that we all, as I mentioned before, we all engage in learning by observing and pitching in. For example, our first language. We've all learned our first language by being a part of a language community where people use words to accomplish things. Excuse me. And they listen in to other people's conversations and they begin to use some of the words that they hear in order to get things done. But there's many other things that we can learn by observing and pitching in. I believe anything can be learned that way, and it's probably a very good way for deep learning in any area. And some examples are up here. First language, learning to weave, the little Mayan girls in the background there. I've worked in this Mayan community, and I'll be referring to it throughout the evening. I've worked in that same Mayan community in Guatemala for 40 years. 40 years ago, all the girls learned to weave. And they learned to weave partially by being present as people were weaving and just hearing the sounds, smelling the smell of the wet threads and so on. Children were included in conversations about the meaning of life, as those children in that photograph were when they were included in a funeral situation where people are talking about what happens when people die, what's the meaning of life, and so on. If they're present and they're involved, they have the opportunity to learn by observing and pitching in. Similarly, the little kid in the reading the book over there, that's my darling grandson, and he is 3, and he's not actually reading in the sense that we usually talk about, but he's surrounded by books, he's surrounded by parents who read, and he has learned how you hold a book, how you make sounds when you hold a book. He's involved in acquiring literacy by observing and pitching in. And for example, most of us learn how to handle software by being involved with other people who are doing it and pitching in on something that we're trying to accomplish. There are strong cultural differences in the opportunities and the skills involved in learning by observing and pitching in. And they have to do with whether people are allowed to be present and contributing to the ongoing activities. The key feature, well, there's many key features, but one of the central ones is the organization of the community. I'm looking around me, and I don't think I see anybody under age 18 here. But the organization of the community that many of us are involved in has adults in one place and children in another, which makes it very difficult for children to be a part of the skilled activities of their family and community. But when children are involved and present, they're able to just learn by being a part of things. And I want to show you this little clip. This is from 1941 in the same community that I've been working in. It was long before my time. But I want you to notice how the girls are just a part of the activity of gathering water for the community, for the family and community. Even the littlest ones, and they're not playing, they're actually contributing. Now things have changed in San Pedro. Many of the activities of the children have changed. Nonetheless, the children still are active in pitching in, being a part of things. In the image on your right, you can see a tourist stand where they're selling fabrics to tourists. The little boy in the front, he's probably 8 or 9. He can run the little stand by himself. His little sister, standing facing us, is probably 3 or 4. She is able to do something. She can probably run and get change for whoever's running the stand if the mom or the brother don't have change. But what's really cool is that little baby, who you probably can't see it very well, but that little baby's eye is looking out at me, the customer, and is fully aware, well, fully aware, as much as a baby that age can be aware of whatever's going on around him. Probably doesn't understand money yet, probably doesn't understand barter systems or cash, but the kid is alert and paying attention to what's going on around him. And he is in a place where he can observe and begin to pitch in. There are fewer opportunities in communities where children are segregated from mature activities, and in many cases, maybe all cases worldwide, we have substituted school lessons and exercises for being actually involved. This became true on a mass scale, a widespread, universal scale, about a century ago, a little over a century ago. And one of the models for the way schools were organized was the factory model. This was explicitly used as a model for trying to bureaucratically handle large numbers of children who were coming into the schools because of big immigration and because of compulsory schooling laws. And so the assembly line, which had just been developed, was seen as a way for the schools to handle large numbers of kids. So I mention this because I'm going to be contrasting learning by observing and pitching in with a form of organizing learning that I refer to as assembly line instruction. It's also known as the banking model or the factory model. It's not the same as schooling, but it's widely used in schools. But before I proceed, I want to make sure to mention that we can all learn in more than one way. And Stephanie was referring to this centrally in what she was talking about as well, is that it's not necessary for us to be limited to one way of doing things. We can learn from each other. I want to also mention that not all schools are organized by assembly line instruction. So when I talk about assembly line instruction, please don't equate it with schooling. Schooling doesn't have to be assembly line instruction. In fact, I've spent many years working in a public school in Utah where the ways that it's organized are much more like learning by observing and pitching in. The kids have a chance to be a part of the activities of the classroom. They get to help design them along with the adults who pitch in together with the kids to accomplish the projects that the community of the classroom develops. And so I think that there's important models of schools that are not run by assembly line instruction. Now, what is involved in learning by observing and pitching in has been one of my goals for the intervening years since I first started working in the Mayan community decades ago. And what I'm going to be showing you as a way of sketching it out is a prism that has 7 facets. We've already talked about the first facet and the second. The first facet being that the learner is incorporated and contributing to the community, and the second facet being that the learner is eager to be involved, wanting to be a part of what's going on around him or her. And that the other people who are involved in the activity, they don't have as their central goal being instruction, but to accomplish something else. And instruction may be a part of their goal, or it might not even be something that they're focusing on. And I'm going to contrast learning by observing and pitching in with the features of assembly line instruction, where the community is organized. Instruction in the community is organized around a bureaucratic setting that's separate from other important settings of the community. And the motive of the child or the learner is to seek rewards extrinsic to the activity itself and to avoid threats. And the motive of the other people is to instruct the child and also to sort them, comparing them with other kids. The third facet I'm going to go into in some more depth. I think it's a really central feature of the social organization of learning by observing and pitching in, which lends itself to a strength in what many Indigenous children bring to schooling and many other settings. This is a matter of working together in a collaborative, flexible group manner. Now, it connects really nicely with what Stephanie Fragberg referred to as an interdependent approach. It involves fluidly coordinating with other people, blending ideas, blending agendas, and the pace, and everybody's engaged. And I want to emphasize one thing which people sometimes overlook in thinking about collaboration, is that anybody can take the initiative in the setting. It's not that people are subjected to the group, but people are contributing to the group with initiative. So it's both people making choices, in a sense, in a big sense, providing leadership as well as working together really fluidly and flexibly with other people. This contrasts with the social organization in assembly line instruction, which most of you have experienced, I think, where the teacher controls what's going on. It's unilateral. They control the learner's pace, the learner's attention and motivation, and they're supposed to be transmitting information, dividing the labor between different teams or different individuals. They don't collaborate in the endeavor with the other people, and the learner's simply supposed to do what they're told. Now, we've done a lot of research on collaboration in different communities, and in a number of studies, we found that there's more collaboration among children of indigenous heritage, and I'm including indigenous heritage of Central America as well as North America in what I'm referring to here. Children from highly schooled family backgrounds seem to be less collaborative. And this is not limited to European American children, but also Mexican heritage kids whose ancestry includes indigenous background, but whose family has several generations of lots of schooling, tend to be less collaborative. It's really important to notice that the ways that the children collaborate differ. And I want to show you what these three girls are going to be doing. They are fluidly coordinating with each other. I'm going to show you the video clip. They're trying to put together a Model B. And so I hope you can see how they're working together. Their minds are connecting. They're sharing ideas and sharing thought and sharing thinking. You see how they're coordinating their movements with their minds are sufficiently engaged that they can connect with what each other is doing. They're not getting in each other's way. They're alert to each other. They understand what each other's trying to do. They're supporting each other. And as my colleague Andy Dayton has mentioned, it's like one organism with 6 arms. They're working together and thinking together in such a sophisticated way. Could you see that? In another study, we examined this kind of collaboration, and we found that Mexican heritage kids of indigenous background were twice as likely to be collaborating with each other in that very sophisticated manner than European heritage middle-class kids. What the middle-class European American kids did more commonly was they divided up the activity. And they did this in several ways. Like the boy that you see on the right, who is pushing his sister out of the way so that he can do the task by himself. That's certainly not sharing ideas. But another common way that the middle-class European American kids engaged in the activity was to take turns. One child, then the other, one, then the other. That's also not sharing ideas or thinking together. So it gets in the way of learning from each other. And a third way that was common among the middle-class European American kids was for one child to take the role of boss and the other child to simply carry out orders, which again divides up the activity in a way that there's no opportunity for them to be sharing ideas and learning from each other. We found that same cultural pattern in a number of different situations. This one is 2 kids working together. These are classmates in this study, working together on programming a computer game. And I'm going to show you something really beautiful, which will take you a minute to understand. But there it is. This is a graph of the difference in performance between the European American middle class kids on your left and the Mexican heritage kids on your right. And it's across the first 10 minutes of their working together. The top little box is the first 10 seconds. So it goes down 10 seconds by 10 seconds for 10 minutes. Each column is a pair of kids. So what I hope you can see is the colors are pretty different on those 2 graphs. The pattern just stands out. I don't have to show you the averages for you to see the pattern. What we have on the left, you see a lot of red, right? That's resistance. That's one kid pushing the other kid out of the way, or another kid saying, no, we're not going to use your idea, we're going to use my idea, or we'll get to that later, but never getting to it. Different kinds of resistance. Much more common among the European American middle class kids. What is common across both of them is very interesting is the green ones. The green ones we call proposal building. That's a form of collaboration, and both groups did that kind of collaboration. There was a difference in a different kind of collaboration, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But the green stuff is one child says, let's do this, and the other child says, okay, and then they work together to accomplish that. Or one side says, let's do this, and the other one says, well, how about that? And then they agree on that, and they work together for a while. Both groups did the same amount of that kind of proposal-building collaboration. What stands out for the Mexican heritage kids is the blue, and that is a kind of very skilled collaboration, like you saw with those 3 girls working on the bee, where they don't even have to make proposals. They're just in sync. They just start going, and they're going, and they don't have to say, let's do this, let's do that. They're like one organism in this case with 4 arms, because they can just read each other and move ahead with thinking together, planning together, doing sophisticated collaboration. I'm going sort of quickly around the prism because I realize it's late, and I know that people are probably not able to spend a whole lot of time on lots of details. So I'm going to tell you quickly about this one, and then the 5th one I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about. The goal of learning by observing and pitching in, is for people to be, their participation in ongoing activities to transform, for them to learn the skills and information of the particular activities that they're engaged in, as well as the kind of consideration and responsibility that supports their being contributors in their family and community. And that contrasts with the goals of learning in assembly line instruction, which involve for information to be, and skills to be transmitted and received. The information is isolated from actually using it in any particular setting. It's just pieces of information and skills. And the purpose is for the certification of the learner, so that they can eventually become contributors, or at least the ones who pass can become contributors. There's some the important difference there has to do with the skills of being a contributor, being responsible and considerate of the other people who are involved in the same or related activities. And I want to mention briefly a couple of aspects of this. On the top 2 images, you see some kids working. We've done a number of studies looking at children's contributions to their families and communities in just helping out around the house. Mexican heritage and Guatemalan indigenous background children often pitch into their family's activities without being asked from a very early age. Like the little girl you see on the left helping, she's in the United States, a little girl helping clean. The two girls on the right who are washing family dishes. We find that this is something that the children just do because this is what families do. People help with what needs to be done. In middle-class families, both in Mexico and in the United States, maybe some of you have noticed, they don't help out so much. And when they do, it's on the basis of being told they have to, being assigned things by somebody else, an adult, and sometimes having to be coerced into doing it. And the assignments are on an individual basis. So they're not learning to contribute with initiative without being asked. Another aspect is the consideration for the direction of the group, which is an important goal of learning for children who are learning to by observing and pitching in. If you're a part of something that's going on, and you're all working towards a common goal, it's really important to be alert to what the other folks are doing. And so you don't interrupt them or get in their way as you're doing it. This is part of the goals of learning if you're in a system of learning, which we're calling learning by observing and pitching in. Now, the fifth facet has to do with how the means by which people learn. And really central to this is observing and contributing, being a part of things. It might be that you're observing and contributing, but you're not in the process of contributing, you're just about to, or it might be while you're contributing. There's guidance in learning by observing and pitching in from not only other people who are around you, but by the expectations of the community. So the little 2-year-olds and 5-year-olds who are helping out around the house in indigenous heritage communities, people aren't saying, you need to do this. But the expectation of the community is, yes, of course, everybody helps. Sometimes that's carried by some comments like, your cousin is not very acomedida, which in Spanish means not very helpful without being asked. And so you know it's criticized when somebody doesn't pitch in. But it's not like people are constantly telling you stuff. It's the community expectations that you learn along the way that provide some guidance. That contrasts with assembly line instruction, where learning is through lessons that are out of the context of the actual activity that somebody is trying to learn. Also exercises and tests. But the important feature is it's out of the context of doing anything productive. So one of the features I've mentioned on the fifth facet is learning by observing. And we were interested in figuring out how that works. And so we devised a scenario. This is work with Mari Correa Chavez. We devised a scenario in which a research assistant, is showing one child how to make a toy. In this case, Marta on the left there is showing the big sister how to make a mouse that runs with a rubber band. And the little brother is sitting off to the side, and he's been told that in a few minutes he's going to have a chance to make a different toy. And he's shown an origami jumping mouse, a jumping frog that he's going to have a chance to make. And he's told, you can sit over here while you wait for your sister to be done. And he's handed a toy to play with. It's a do-nothing toy where you run a crank and it does nothing. And it's kind of interesting, but just for a minute or two. And so our purpose in the setup was to put the child who's waiting in a situation where they're not invited to join the sister's activity, but they're not excluded either, and they have something to do for a little while. And we're interested in the child who's waiting. So I'm going to show you a video clip. This is in the Mayan town of San Pedro, and I want to show you what the child, pay attention to the child on your right and his attention pattern. You would almost think it was a still photograph if you only looked at that little boy. He is so attentive to what's going on. Okay, we did used the same situation in Santa Cruz with middle-class European American kids. I'll show you a clip of this group.
Let's do this first. Roll this up.
Crashing everything in sight. Going to explode.
Leave it about this much.
This much.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Now, next step.
So you could tell he wasn't quite as attentive to what his sister and the research assistant were doing. He did glance over at them momentarily, but we didn't think he was trying to figure out what they were doing so much as trying to figure out why they weren't paying attention to what he was doing. And you can see in the other two photographs over there, they're not clips but photos, you can see the attentiveness of those middle-class kids as well. And in looking at the sample as a whole, the kind of sustained attention that you saw with the Mayan boy was twice as frequent among Mayan families where there was not a whole lot of schooling in the family. We're calling them Maya traditional families. It was twice as common as among European American middle-class kids. Interestingly, Mayan families where there was a lot of schooling were intermediate between those other two backgrounds. And one of the things that we're very interested in pursuing is what happens when people have experience in more than one cultural system, as Mayan kids whose families have a lot of Western schooling are. And many children throughout the world from indigenous backgrounds are also in Western schooling situations which many times conflict with their values or skills. So what happens in that case? Which practices survive that? Which practices modify? Which practices are lost? And in the case of this kind of attentiveness that I'm showing you here, it looks like the Mayan kids with families with 12 or more years of schooling are a little bit more like the Mayan traditional families, but they're in between. And that's the general pattern we've been finding across a lot of studies, is that they're in between, sometimes closer to their ethnic background group and sometimes closer to the schooling background group. And I think that's a really important area to continue to pursue. This is sort of what I was just telling you, is that we found the same pattern. Well, actually, it's a little different. We found the same pattern in a number of groups with indigenous background. Part of our question was, how widespread is this among indigenous groups? I mean, the Maya are quite different from the indigenous groups up here in many ways. Are there some similarities? Well, we did a lot of work in Mexico to look at in backgrounds whether Mexican indigenous heritage kids used the same kind of sustained attention as Mayan indigenous children in Guatemala, and also in the United States, Mexican heritage kids in the United States. And we found the same pattern with Mexican kids whose family background was more connected with indigenous heritage, showing more sustained attention, Mexican kids whose families had lots of schooling showing less, and European heritage middle-class kids showing less sustained attention as well. I hope you're noticing, as I go around this prism, that there's some features that are real strengths in the children who have the opportunities to learn by observing and pitching in, which in the case of our research tends to be the children from indigenous backgrounds. The one that I'm emphasizing here is the attentiveness to what's going on around them, learning from whatever's happening. But I also earlier talked about the children's initiative in pitching in to help. And before that, the very sophisticated collaboration that the children were engaged in from communities where children learn by observing and pitching in. These are strengths that we don't often hear about when we find out a bit about kids' outcomes or kids' achievements and so on. I think that's a real problem. I think we need to, all of us, be skilled in those areas, and that there's a model that we can see in how the children that we've been studying here show some strengths, some sophisticated collaboration skills, initiative, and alertness to what's going on around them, that we should be helping them build on in school, as well as children from other backgrounds learning from, and adults, and learning from the models that are provided. The sixth facet focuses on the kind of communication that's involved in learning by observing and pitching in, which is something that we all engage in without really thinking about it very much, but it's very, you don't have to have so much blah, blah, blah if you're in the same situation with somebody working on the same thing. I don't know how to say that in a very sophisticated way, but, well, parsimonious is another way to put it, but that has some other meanings as well. So if you're weaving together with somebody, or if you're working on some computer software with somebody, you can just point at the screen or point at the weaving, or you could just indicate to the person you need to back up a little bit, and that tightens the tension on the loom. You don't have to say, oh, the sticks are going to fall out because you're sitting too far forward and you have to maintain the tension on the loom with your body, so you need to lean back a little bit. You don't have to say all that because, blah, blah, blah part, because you're there and they're there, and you can point and refer to something that's ongoing. But if you're removed from the situation, you have to have lengthy explanations because you can't refer to something that's ongoing. So an important part of the communication in learning by observing and pitching it is based on the shared reference that people have in the situation. It also involves, really importantly, the use of narratives, storytelling that builds a context for the people who get involved in the story, and dramatization, which sometimes happens with teasing and other, well, instructional ribbing and other ways of involving people in a context. And I will give you just an example here of the importance of shared reference. In the image on the upper right, that's an image from about 1541 in Aztec community. The mother is teaching the daughter how to weave. She's using words. You can see that with the little green scroll that's coming out of her mouth. That's a symbol for speaking. And she's also gesturing, and the daughter is able to learn from her gestures and her speech. The image on the lower left is actually my daughter. She's not Mayan, she's mine. And she was 7. She didn't speak a language in common with the woman who was teaching her. The woman spoke Sutuhil only, my daughter spoke English only, and they were nonetheless able to communicate quite a bit, not as well as if they had a language in common, but they could communicate quite a bit. You can see the woman is making a gesture with her hands that shows the girl how hard she's supposed to pull that stick down to get the threads to do the right thing. The girl on your right, Maria, is 13, and she has much more basis in the shared reference than my daughter did, because she can understand the language of the people around her. She can also see other people weaving while she's weaving. So she has a very full-scale learning environment that doesn't require lots of blah, blah, blah. And that contrasts with assembly line instruction, in which communication is based on a limited range of formats because people are limited in what they can refer to. Often it's explanations out of the context of ongoing activity, and it also includes quiz questions, like, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Actually, this moment. You may recognize this in how you or others interact with little children, but I'm going to play this clip for you of a mother interacting with her 1-year-old, and it's hard to hear, so there's a transcript above in what they say. So let me play the script. This is quiz questions.
Who's that? The hat. Who's that? Who was that? What is it? Eye.
Can do a little better.
Nose. Show me the nose. Show me the nose.
You probably couldn't hear it, but each one of the black part is an adult asking the child a question that they already know the answer to. The blue part is little Sarah trying to answer. And the red part is an adult who is evaluating or correcting the answer of the child. So quiz questions, they're also known as known answer questions, where somebody asks a question that they already know the answer to. It's really weird. It happens throughout school. But if I asked, say, Stephanie here, what color's your jacket? Blue. But she said it with a question mark. Blue? Why would you be asking me that? And in many cases, in communities where this is not a very common form of talk, it's taken as a riddle. Why would this person be asking me this question? It's like strange. There must be something deeper to this question because they can see. So that's a common thing that happens in middle-class families in the United States. It's very uncommon in the Mayan community, at least it was 40 years ago. I want to go back. I keep going back, and my next study is probably to see, are they asking known answer questions now? Because much more schooling and many other changes in San Pedro. That's the same format that's often used in school. And let me play that for you.
Helping verbs. David, you see one?
Have.
Yes. Any other helpers? Emily?
Was.
Yes. Excellent.
Did you see it's the same format? Known answer question, student responds, teacher or other adult evaluates. So you can like Stephanie was saying, there are some formats that are just unusual to people and then they don't know what to do with it. This is a format that's commonly used in school that children in some communities don't meet up with until they get to school, and then it's very puzzling. A friend of mine said he's Mexican heritage and Apache, and he said his first day of school, he came home from school and he told his mom he wasn't going back. And she said, why not? And he said, well, the teacher doesn't know nothing. And the mother said, how can that be? The teacher has been to school a lot, she's a smart woman. And the child said, well, if she's so smart, how come she has to ask me the answer to those questions? So the final feature of learning by observing and pitching in contrasts with assembly line instruction, and that is assessment. And you're all familiar with assessment in assembly line instruction, or you wouldn't probably be here. Its purpose is to sort learners and test them. It's separate from the learning itself, and feedback comes from extrinsic rewards and threats and ranking of students against each other. It has real consequences in people's life, is very powerful. It determines so many people's lives, every person's life in the United States, probably, that form of assessment. Here, I want to play a little clip. Well, maybe I'll skip that in the interest of time. It has consequences beyond just how well you do in school. And it can, you want to play it? Ask me in the questions, because she's holding up a sign that says 1 minute. Assessment in learning by observing and pitching in is done quite differently. It has to do with appraising not only the child's learning, but the supports that are provided for the child, making it possible for the child to make progress. It is in order to aid the child's contribution to the ongoing endeavor, and it occurs during the endeavor to support the child. And the feedback comes from the adequacy of the contribution that the child is making. So if I make a tortilla and it's fed to the chickens, as opposed to put on the pile of tortillas for the family, it tells me something about the adequacy of my tortilla. Nobody has to say, very good. So it's sort of built into being a part of things. And what I want to point out regarding assessment is, if we are trying to change away from assembly line instruction, which almost everybody is, we need to somehow escape the kind of assessment that is involved in assembly line instruction, because otherwise, whatever else we do is going to be pulled into assembly line instruction. It's very powerful. So I want to sum up by just going over the basic argument that it's especially common for people to be having the opportunity to learn and pitch in some communities compared with others. Often indigenous communities have this way of organizing learning is very prominent, and it involves the children learning by being present, observing, and pitching in. In the process, the children become fluent in collaborating with initiative, being helpful, responsible, showing consideration for the direction of the group, and they learn to be attentive, widely and keenly, to what's going on around them. And families and communities support children by learning by observing and pitching in, by including children, valuing their contributions, encouraging children to notice what's going on and to contribute, and supporting the children's initiative and responsibility. In communities where children are often segregated and use Western schooling, LOPI is less prevalent, but it's still quite valuable. And there are some schools that employ similar practices to learning by observing and pitching in to build deep understanding. So it can be successful in schools as well. It's certainly successful in families and in whole communities where it's a prevalent part of people's learning. And I think a really important aspect for the future is figuring out, how do we think about culture change? I mentioned this book, which was written by myself and a prominent midwife in San Pedro, about changes in San Pedro across her lifetime, 80 years of her life, and earlier as well, thinking about the changes in this indigenous community over generations. But I hope you have noticed that I'm also arguing for changes in middle-class life in the United States. And there's really no escaping change in the way cultural practices work, but it's a matter of thinking about, well, what could we do differently that would be useful to us? And which ways that we're doing things should we really be maintaining or shoring up or protecting? And so I think that that's a question that the cultural research that we've been talking about this evening can help us think about, is how can we learn from each other? How can we protect what we have, or maybe learn something new that we might prefer as a way of organizing things for the future? And with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm glad you're still here.